I can't believe no one's talking about how Vegas is projecting 5 games to be 50 points or more this weekend. Let's go ahead and talk about it. I got quarterbacks, tight ends, and defenses. And starting off S tier, welcome back to the fold. We have Lamar Jackson. If you've been waiting, he's back. Starts it off with a 51.5 point over-under on Thursday Night Football versus the Dolphins. Josh Allen versus Patrick Mahomes. That's a 52.5 point over-under. You might be a little frustrated with Josh Allen just given his points per game, but let me tell you, the last time he's played Mahomes in his last 4 matchups, he scored 20, 23, 26, and 36 points. Mahomes, obviously, no question there. You're starting him 3 touchdowns or more in 4 of his last 5 starts. So let's get into it with A tier. That's when we really start to get into the nitty-gritty. Daniel Jones versus Steelers. 50.5 point over-under. Now, the Steelers give up the second most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I had a lot of confidence in Jordan Love last week when he really hasn't had any great games so far in the season, but the Steelers allowed that to happen. He's the quarterback 6 on the season. He's scored over 22 fantasy points in 5 of his last 8 games. And Drake May versus the Atlanta Falcons. Now, the Atlanta Falcons are the 4th hardest matchup for quarterbacks, but don't tell that to Drake May. Tua just went for 205 yards and 4 passing touchdowns in Atlanta just last weekend. Now, Tua is the first quarterback this season to throw for over 200 yards on the Falcons. Drake May, he's faced tough defenses this season. Just last week, he faced off against the Browns and ended up as the quarterback 2. May's also rushed for 50 yards or more in back-to-back games, so even if he can't get it done through the air, which he has, he's been the best deep thrower in the game this season, he's always got his legs to rely on. And then Justin Herbert versus the Tennessee Titans, back-to-back games for Herbert with 3 passing touchdowns. You can run on the Titans easier than you can throw on them, but either way, I'm not scared of the matchup at all for the quarterback 4 on the season. Jaden Daniels versus the Seattle Seahawks. Now, if he had Terry McLaurin, I'd probably have him a little bit higher. There's only been one team that has scored more than 20 points against the Seattle Seahawks. That was the Bucs in Week 5. Jaden Daniels is always a threat to move the ball on the ground. All right, now let's go into B tier. We started off with Jackson Dart. He has been the quarterback 5 since taking over in New York. That is tied in fantasy points with Jalen Hurts during that span. The 49ers, they are middle of the pack versus the quarterback. Darius Slayton is back into the lineup, so that's good for the Giants. It's also been rumored that the Giants have been in trade interest for a high-profile wide receiver. Now, Dak Prescott versus Arizona, 53.5 point over-under. This is the highest one of the week. I want almost every single player in this matchup. Now, Dak did have a bad week last week. I mentioned it was a horrible matchup versus the Broncos. Thought he would do a little bit better, but came just short. Now, the Cardinals, they are a tough matchup too, but not nearly as tough as the Denver Broncos. I'm personally willing to go right back to Dak Prescott. Sam Darnold versus the Washington Commanders. The Commanders have allowed 3 passing touchdowns in back-to-back games. Darnold is my quarterback 10 this week, and it is the 5th easiest matchup for quarterbacks. Now, Matthew Stafford, he gets to play the New Orleans Saints. I moved Stafford all around this week. This is the highest that I could rank him. 3 out of his last 4 matchups, he's scored 25 fantasy points or more. Floor is low, though, because he's not mobile. So keeps throwing 3 touchdowns, which he's been doing at a consistent rate. Then, obviously, you stay in the flames with him. And Joe Flacco versus the Chicago Bears, 51.5 point over-under. He did not practice on Wednesday. If he plays, I'm okay playing him. He's throwing the ball a lot, and he has the weapons to make him very fantasy relevant. Now, just do keep this in mind. I am no medical professional, but from the doctors that I follow and I trust, the AC joint sprain that he's got on his throwing shoulder is something that could be easily aggravated. So if he takes a hit in it the wrong way, if he falls down on it, he will be sidelined. And then in C tier, let's go to the other side of the ball. I've got Caleb Williams versus Cincinnati. Again, 51.5 point over-under. It's a pretty easy matchup on the ground, plus through the air. Joe Flacco suiting up obviously helps this game keep it close, so Caleb Williams will need to be used more often. Now, Caleb had back-to-back games with 0 touchdowns. That's not great, but how high-scoring Vegas projects this game seems like he's going to be a fine play. This could easily be a DeAndre Swift game. As I said, you can run the ball on them just as easy as you could throw it on them. The Bengals are dead last against running backs, and Trey Hendrickson is probably not going to suit up here this game. Kyler Murray versus the Dallas Cowboys. Now, the matchup says it is great. They give up the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. but my confidence level isn't super high. Kyler hasn't scored over 20 points in a single game this season. Jordan Love versus the Carolina Panthers. Now, I told you to start him versus the Steelers because it's the second easiest matchup. Now, this week, the Packers are 13.5-point home favorites. Love averages 26 pass attempts per game at home, which is the third lowest in the NFL. It could easily be a lot of Josh Jacobs and Emmanuel Wilson because they are highly favored in this game. I like Love a lot in the right matchups, especially with Christian Watson coming back, so hopefully he can move from a streaming quarterback in the right matchup to a week in and week out starter. Brock Purdy versus the New York Giants. It may very well be Mac Jones, but Brock Purdy as of right now is limited in practice. Still don't know if he's suiting up, but the matchup is great for whichever quarterback does suit up. The Giants give up the third most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Now, Jared Goff versus the Vikings. Goff is a funny quarterback because he always ends up as like a top 12 quarterback, but he's wildly inconsistent on when that comes. He has a lot of spike games, and he has a lot of average or below average games for fantasy football. They're 8.5-point favorites. The Vikings just let Kamani Vidal run all over them, and now they get to face Sonic and Knuckles. I like Goff a lot in games where they're certainly going to need him, but I'm not sure this week versus JJ McCarthy and the Vikings is that game. All right, now starting off a D tier, I do have Trevor Lawrence kicking it off. He might not have Brian Thomas Jr. this week. He's only had one game over 20 fantasy points this season. If Brian Thomas suited up and the matchup was even easier, he'd be in streaming consideration, but probably not this week. Bo Nix versus the Houston Texans. Now, this is the one I might catch a little bit of flack for because he is so much lower in my rankings. He's been hot these last 2 weeks. Well, really the last 5 quarters, because if you watch the Giants game, it was just the last quarter where they scored, 33 points. Nevertheless, 39.5-point over-under here. It is by far the lowest of the week, and the reason is they both have elite defenses, both the Denver Broncos, the Houston Texans. And for what it's worth, the Texans have more interceptions than passing touchdowns allowed on the season. So Bo Nix, for me, is not in streaming consideration. And Tua versus Baltimore, this is a 51.5-point over-under. The Ravens, they give up the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I wanted to put him higher. It was this time last season when he got hot. Just last week, he threw for 4 touchdowns versus the Falcons defense, which they are very good. We know this. I just don't think we can forget that the 2 weeks prior to that, he had weak losing weeks for your fantasy team. Now, I could see him as high as B tier, but he's 1-4 on Thursday Night Football. Last time he won was in 2021, which, funny enough, was against the Ravens. Now, he's also failed to throw for over 160 yards in 4 of those 5 primetime games. Obviously, those situations are unique, but crumbling under primetime pressure is a real thing. And Aaron Rodgers versus the Indianapolis Colts, this is a 50.5-point over-under. He's a fine play. We know that the Colts are going to put up a lot of points, but their defense is still pretty good versus quarterbacks, only allowing the 7th most fantasy points. Going on to E tier, we started off with JJ McCarthy versus the Detroit Lions. They are 8.5-point underdogs. He's failed to throw for 160 yards in either of his first 2 starts. He has the weapons to do it, obviously. Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson to an extent. But in his 3rd NFL start, coming back from injury, I think you can do better than to gamble at your quarterback position. Now, Geno Smith versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. In his last 4 games, he's got 3 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. Now, the Jags, they give up the 6th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, but they also average 2 takeaways per game, which is 2nd best in the NFL. CJ Stroud versus the Denver Broncos. Again, 39.5-point over-under. The Broncos give up the 3rd fewest points to quarterbacks. If I'm not confident in starting Bo Nix, I'm not sure what would make you believe that I'm going to start CJ Stroud here this week. And then Michael Penix versus the New England Patriots. Limited on Wednesday's practice, the Patriots have allowed the 6th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. He hasn't scored 20 points since week 1. And for those of you who are playing in much, much deeper leagues, here is F tier and how I would rank them. And yeah, Tyler Shuck is now the starting quarterback for the New Orleans Saints for the rest of the season. All right, let's go ahead and talk about some tight ends. Starting it off with S tier, we have Tyler Warren, Trey McBride, Jake Ferguson, and George Kittle. Now, I get countless questions in my live streams. Who should I start, Jake Ferguson or George Kittle or Trey McBride? Let me go ahead and set the record straight. If you have 2 of these guys, you're doing yourself a disservice. You need to trade one of them. Combine your running back 2 or your wide receiver 2 with one of these guys and trade them to a tight end needy team and upgrade at one of those positions that you start multiple of each and every single week. And A tier is a lot of the same of that. You have Brock Bowers, Rondé Gadsden, and Tucker Kraft. A lot of people earlier in the season picked up Rondé Gadsden off waivers and maybe had Brock Bowers, maybe have Tucker Kraft. You need to be trading one of these two tight ends. You shouldn't be rostering two elite tight ends when there are so many teams that need elite tight ends and you can upgrade at another position. But nevertheless, Brock Bowers versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's finally healthy. He's practicing in full. He's ahead of the other two guys despite them being great so far in these last few games, mainly because the Raiders, I think, will need him much more than the other two will need them in their matchups. And we're going to talk about those matchups as well. Rondé Gadsden versus the Tennessee Titans. Gadsden could go crazy this game. I looked at the Titans defense. I saw that they run zone almost 80% of the time. And Gadsden versus zone has a 3.37 yards per route run. For those of you who don't know, that's elite. Among all tight ends, that's by far number one. But among all pass catchers, so including wide receivers, only JSN, Puka Nacua, Rashee Rice, and Drake London have higher yards per route run versus zone. And then Tucker Kraft versus the Carolina Panthers, they're 13.5-point favorites. It doesn't favor a lot of passing work in this game. I talked about Jordan Love earlier and how low the passing volume has been. Doesn't mean don't start Kraft, just maybe temper your expectations and hope that it happens in the first half. Now, let's jump into B tier. I started with Kyle Pitts. He's got a nice matchup versus the Patriots. That is their weakness. They allow the 5th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Now, Pitts, he's had 16 receptions over these last 2 games. As long as he continues to be used in the offense, I think he's streamable in the right matchup, and this is one of those situations. Now, Travis Kelce versus the Buffalo Bills. This is a 52.5-point over-under. In their last 3 matchups, they've hit 50 points or over, coming off his best game of the season, which is a little surprising, perhaps because Rashee Rice coming back into the fold. You thought that maybe Travis Kelce was going to see a few less looks. But the matchup isn't exactly great. The Bills are second best against tight ends, but with how high scoring this game is supposed to be, I do like Kelce this week. And then Sam Laporta versus the Minnesota Vikings. He is a beast. Let's just go ahead and say that. So he might look lower in the rankings. I know he's great, but for fantasy football, I talked about it with Jared Goff. They're favored in this game. I'm not 100% sure they're going to need Laporta from a volume perspective, but he's always a threat for a touchdown. And then let's go into C tier. I do start it with Dalton Kincaid. Again, we talked about this game, 52.5-point over-under versus the Kansas City Chiefs. I want basically all the pieces in this game. The Chiefs are 4th best against tight ends. But there aren't really any receiving options that are reliable for that offense besides Dalton Kincaid and Khalil Shakir. Zach Ertz versus the Seattle Seahawks. Now, Terry McLaurin has already been ruled out in this game, so more targets should flow his way. What's most important, though, is Jaden Daniels is back, and that's huge because Ertz has been downright awful without Jaden Daniels. It's the perfect streaming tight end situation if you need one. Now, Mark Andrews versus the Miami Dolphins, 51.5-point over-under. He's much better with Lamar in at quarterback as well, as you could imagine. Now, Isaiah Likely is a concern. He's getting more run in the offense. I'd really like to wait and see, if possible, how all 3 of them perform in the same game. And then in D tier, I do start it off with the 10th overall pick, Mr. Colston Loveland. These are people that you could play in a pinch. He gets to play Cincinnati. Now, it is a 51.5-point over-under. If Cole Kmet were to miss this game with his back injury, Loveland faces the number 1 easiest matchup for tight ends. Ideally, again, he's just a stash, but in deeper leagues, I think you could play him. Theo Johnson versus the San Francisco 49ers. He could see more targets with Cam Scadaboo now out for the season. That's a 12% target share that has been vacated. He's really been touchdown or bust so far, but it doesn't mean it'll stay that way. Again, stash guys for right now. And then Jawan Johnson versus the Rams. Finally getting targets again like he did earlier in the season. The Saints are 14.5-point underdogs, so you would expect a lot of passing work to come his way. All right, now the last tight ends in E and F tier. Ideally, you're not playing any of these guys in a 12 or even 14-team league. They've really been touchdown or bust. I know Dalton Schultz sold us down the river last week. You could go back to him, but again, it's all sketchy in E and F tier. All right, now let's talk defenses and wrap this thing up. Starting it off with the Rams versus the Saints and the Chargers versus the Titans. Both of these defenses are facing rookie quarterbacks on offenses that are averaging 16 points per game or less, so that's always nice. Going into A tier, we have a lot more teams. I like a lot of these defenses here. All of them have lower over-unders or a team is highly favored, so that always bodes well for the defense. In B tier, I do have two teams. It is going to be the 49ers, who are favored on the road versus the Giants against a rookie quarterback, and the Colts, who are 5th in takeaways per game. Now, in C tier, this is about where I'd be happy with streaming defenses. Going into D, E, and F tier, it gets really, really bad. But the Seattle Seahawks versus Washington, they've played 7 games so far this season, and they've only allowed one team to score over 20 points. Now, the Baltimore Ravens defense versus the Miami Dolphins, this is really a play against Tua. He looked great last week against the Atlanta Falcons, and they're a great defense. Now, the Baltimore Ravens, unless they're healthy, they're not great. But I don't think we should lose sight of Tua. The 2 games before just last week against Atlanta, the 2 games previous, he turned the ball over 6 times and he fumbled 3 times. In the Chicago Bears versus the Cincinnati Bengals, I like the Bears a lot more if Joe Flacco does not suit up. We want to play our defenses against Jake Browning, but even if he does, the Bears are number 1 in takeaways per game with 2.3 takeaways per game. Now, going into D tier, I do start it off with the Giants versus the 49ers. If Mac Jones suits up, that's a little bit better for that matchup. The Falcons, they're a great defense, but the Patriots have been elite so far this season on offense. They have the 8th most points per game, 28-3. And then in E and F tier, I combine them together because really you don't want to stream a lot of these defenses. They are deep league plays only. The only one you might consider, and why I have the Commanders in E tier alone, is because you're betting against Sam Darnold. But in 2025, even 2024, betting against Sam Darnold has not been great. And this is my last video of the week, but I do go live each and every single day. So if you haven't already, make sure you click subscribe, hit the notification bell button so you know when I go live, and I'll see you in the next video.